Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesday in the Word. Well, this week I decided to go to a story of a character that I think almost everyone has heard of. At least one incident in this character's life that you're probably familiar with. Maybe you heard it in a Sunday school class. Maybe you've never even been in a Sunday school class, and yet somehow you've still managed to hear about this one specific detail of this one particular character and what it was that happened in their life. But here's what I'm going to go ahead and tell you. I don't know if I'll call this a disclaimer, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you there are a couple of questions that I have about this character's story that for me, I just haven't been able to find a good, satisfactory answer for. Now, that's not to say there aren't plenty of theories. In fact, if you research this particular character, you're going to come up with a whole list, 3 or 4 or 5 different theories to answer this one particular question. And then there's just a theory that operates, or the interpretation that operates around the idea that you just kind of ignore that this thing is there. It's like if you just pretend you don't see this, then you don't have to figure out why it happened this way. It's one of those times that I really struggle to understand exactly what causes God to act in the way that God acts. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, but I want to spend a little time this evening with you discussing a man whose name is Balaam. Now, chances are when you hear the name Balaam, the first thing that comes to your mind is a guy with a donkey, right? You remember Balaam who had that experience where the donkey spoke to him? And maybe you know that the story of Balaam involves a donkey that speaks. But you may have no more concept of what happened in the life of Balaam than that. And I think it's a pretty fascinating journey. It takes place in the book of Numbers. Now, I like the book of Numbers personally because you begin reading through your Old Testaments. Genesis, there's a lot of action. Exodus, and then you get to Leviticus, and Leviticus is a harder book to read. It's a more tedious book. There's a little bit less in terms of action, and obviously more in terms of law and rules and those kinds of things. Then you get to the book of Numbers, and things kind of pick back up. You've got this, the journey of the people of Israel. And there's interaction there with Moses and Aaron and Miriam, and there's just a lot more to kind of engage with in this story. Well, it's during this particular time that the people of Israel are moving toward the Promised Land. And they've had a couple of, I guess you'd call them military engagements. They're certainly not a military force, but they've had a couple of engagements where they've been victorious over 2 kings, Sihon and Og. And so the next logical enemy is a guy named Balak. Now, Balak is the king of the Moabite people, the people of Moab. And he is worried because he looks and he sees Israel and he sees what happened to the people that they've come up against before. And so he decides that the best way to deal with them is not by coming up with some unique military strategy, not by studying those battles. Instead, he decides that the best way to deal with these people is to call in a prophet and have them cursed. Because surely if you can get them cursed, then everything's going to go your way. And so that's where we pick up the story of Balaam in Numbers chapter 22. We find Balak there who's worried. Beginning in verse 1, I just want to read a few verses. Then the sons of Israel journeyed and camped in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan, opposite Jericho. Now Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. So Moab was in great fear because of the people. They were very numerous. And Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. Now, I want you to listen to this description. I want you to listen to how it is suggested that Israel will treat them if they just let them come on into their territory of Moab. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will lick up all that is around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field." Now you think about that for a moment. Right? If you've ever seen cattle out in a field, if you've ever seen how they eat the grass and how they can really take down the grass in a particular area, it's one of the reasons that cattle farmers move their stock from one pasture to another to allow the grass to recover. The people of Moab said, "We kind of feel like that grass in the field. And we feel like this very numerous nation that's coming against us is going to treat us just like that. So we got to do something about it." And then we learned that Balak is king of Moab at the time. So he sends messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river, in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Behold, the people came out of Egypt. Behold, they are covering the surface of the land, and they are living opposite me. Now therefore, please come, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. So we have Balak, the king of Moab, and we have Balaam, some sort of prophet. Now there's a lot of discussion about exactly what kind of prophet he is. Is he in fact a prophet of Yahweh who is already in a position of doing this kind of thing? Or is he another in a long list of people at this particular time who were kind of pay for what you get prophets? They were people who would speak to gods for you. They would sort of act as your spiritual attorney. It's a little hard to know because there's not a lot of background information on Balaam. However, what we do know going forward, or maybe reading backward, if we go as far even in the book of Revelation, we look back at Balaam, there's really not much good that is said about him. And yet, here in these next few verses, we're going to see some direct interaction between Balaam the prophet and Yahweh himself. And so, at the very least, there is some mystery surrounding exactly who Balaam is and exactly what constitutes the nature of his relationship with the one true God of heaven. And so Balak has been pretty straightforward, right? He said, look, these people are too many for me. I know what they've done, and I know what they're going to do here, and I know you have a reputation that whoever you pronounce a blessing over, it goes well. But whoever you pronounce a curse over is cursed. And so that's what I want you to do. I'm going to hire you to come and curse my enemies so that this doesn't go that way. Verse 7. So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the fees for divination in their hand. There was a price to be paid. And they came to Balaam and reported Balak's words to him. He said, spend the night here, and I'll bring word back to you as the Lord may speak to me. So the leaders of Moab stayed with Balaam. And then God came to Balaam and said, who are these men with you? And Balaam said, Balak, the son of Zippor, the king of Moab, has sent word to me. Behold, there's a people who came out of Egypt. They covered the surface of the land. Now come curse them for me. Perhaps I can fight against them and drive them out. And God said to Balaam, do not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. So Balaam arose in the morning and said to Balak's leaders, go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the leaders of Moab arose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refused to come with us. Now, only reading up to this point, you might think that Balaam was like so many of the other prophets that worked for God, that were God's spokespeople. I'm not convinced that that's who he is, but it kind of reads that way in this part of the story, right? So they come, money in hand, ready to pay him. And there's not a lot of discussion about whether he accepts this payment or not, but he says, hang on, it'll take me overnight to see what I can do. And overnight, the one true God of heaven, Yahweh himself, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, speaks to Balaam and says, what's going on? Balaam tells him, and he says, no, you're not going to go curse these people. These people are blessed. Don't go. And so that's what he reports. Up to this point, we think, what's wrong with Balaam, right? Balaam's a good guy. Balaam was not bought off by the important people who came. End of story. Except the story doesn't end there. So we pick back up in the text. Verse number 15. So Balak again sent leaders, more numerous and more distinguished than the former. He's trying to impress him with not only the money that he's sending, but the messengers that are bringing it, right? They came to Balaam and said to him, thus says Balak the son of Zippor, let nothing, I beg you, hinder you from coming to me, for I will indeed honor you richly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Please come, curse this people for me. I'll offer you whatever it takes. I'll send the most important people I've got. And it's reasonable to assume that maybe the progression would continue, the offer would increase, and maybe even Balak himself would come. to plead for this cursing. Now again, at this point, listen to the response. Balaam says, "Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything, either small or great, contrary to the command of the Lord my God. Now please also stay here tonight, and I'll find out what else the Lord will speak to me." So God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "If the men have come to call you, rise up and go with them. But only the word which I speak, so shall you do." So Balaam arose in the morning and saddled his donkey, and he went with the leaders of Moab. Now this is really unusual to me, and this is where it starts to get into some territory that I'm not sure. I kind of get it up to this point. But even here, Balaam seems like a guy who is saying the right things. They've come and the offer has gone up, but he says, "Listen, I've already told you only what the Lord tells me. That's all I can do." And so I'll ask him again. Now, right here, a lot of commentators and scholars will kind of tear into, well, he should have accepted the word of the Lord the first time. Except the Lord speaks to him again. And the Lord says, "Okay, you can go, but only say what I tell you to say." All right. Now, to me, that seems very plain that maybe this wasn't God's original idea, but it's not the only time in the story of God and his interaction with people that God changes his mind or does something different than what he initially said he was going to do, right? I don't mean that God is a wishy-washy God, but we have other examples in Scripture of God speaking something and then changing his mind, at least to a human perspective. Now maybe God is above all that, and what God decides and what God does doesn't fit in the parameters of what we're talking about anyway. Nonetheless, as we look at this, it seems that God just gave Balaam permission to go, but restricted what he was to say and what he was to do. So Balaam got up and went with them. And by the way, some will also question Balaam's motivation here. And they'll say, well, he was just in it for the money. He just wanted what, the price that they brought. He was, that's the only reason he wanted to go was because of the money. Except God told him to go. And that's where you'll see why this becomes an issue. Verse 22 of Numbers 22. But God was angry because he was going. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. Now he was riding his donkey, and his two servants were with him, and the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with a sword drawn in his hand. And the donkey turned off from the way and went into the field. But Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back into the way. Then the angel of the Lord stood in the narrow path of the vineyards with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed herself to the wall and pressed Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went a little further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn to the right or left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam was angry and struck the donkey with his stick. And the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you've struck me these 3 times? Then Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you've made a mockery of me. If I'd had a sword in my hand, I'd have killed you by now." And the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you've ridden all your life to this day? Have I ever been accustomed to doing this to you?" And he said, "No." Now pause right there. Have you ever heard such an unusual story? Okay, so it seems that God tells Balaam to go, but then God is angry with Balaam over going. And there's a whole discussion we will not wade into about the will of God and the permissive will of God, and that this was not what God really wanted, but God was going to allow it. But it wasn't, God was not pleased with Balaam for doing it. May I just be perfectly honest? I don't understand this. I don't understand how God speaks and says to Balaam, "Go ahead and go, just do as I say and say as I say." And then God is angry with him for going and puts the angelic adversary in his way. As if that was not strange enough. You have somehow or other this angelic being that the donkey can see. No one else can see it, but the donkey can see it. And I can just picture Balaam being so frustrated with his mount that he grabs that stick and just whacks her and tries to make her do right. If that was not strange enough, the donkey starts talking. And Balaam is not surprised. Do you notice this? Balaam doesn't say, "Whoa, who knew my donkey could talk?" Instead, the donkey starts talking and Balaam just starts talking back. And they start having a conversation. The donkey says, "Dude, you've known me your whole life. You ever known me to act crazy like this? I'm not a crazy acting donkey." And Balaam says, "Well, no, as a matter of fact, you're not. That's true." What in the world is going on here? And why is Balaam not shocked? Is this the first time his donkey has spoken to him? Maybe not. Maybe God has used his donkey to speak to him before. If the donkey was accustomed to speaking, why didn't the donkey the very first time say, "Dude, there's an angel with a sword right up here"? But that's not what happened either. There is so much unusual stuff happening in this story that I love it. And it frustrates me at the same time because I can't make all these pieces fit together. And if it's not enough that the man standing in the road talking to his donkey who sees the invisible angel, then the Lord, verse 31, opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in his way with a drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed down to the ground. The angel of the Lord said, "Why'd you strike your donkey 3 times? I've come out to you as an adversary because your way was contrary to me. But the donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times, and if she hadn't, I would have killed you just now and let her live." Wait, what? The donkey saw me and saved you. If you'd have come 1 step farther on that donkey, I was going to kill you. But the donkey backed up. Except that the angel of the Lord was in one place and the donkey went off the road. Then the angel of the Lord moved and the donkey tried to get up against the side. And then the angel of the Lord moved farther down the road. So was the angel of the Lord really going to kill Balaam? Or was this something intended to get his... I mean, if the angel of the Lord was going to kill Balaam, if he didn't keep... But why did he... You see, there's so many questions that this creates in my mind. It is not the simple, cute little flannel graph Sunday school story of a man and his talking donkey. It is far more complicated than that. Now, here's Balaam hearing all this, and he says in verse 34, "I've sinned. I did not know that you were standing in the way against me. Now then, if it is displeasing to you," listen to this, "I will turn back." So God says go, but then God is angry with him because he went, and sends the adversarial sword-bearing angel of the Lord to stand in the way and stop him and almost kill him. And he says, "Look, I'll turn around and go home." But then the angel says, "No, it's okay." Back in the text, verse 35, the angel of the Lord said, "Go with the men, but speak only the word which I tell you." So Balaam went along with the leaders of Balak. I don't get this. Why didn't the angel say, "Yes, as a matter of fact, the Lord wants you to go back home"? I don't know if underneath all this and the part of it that we can't see, if Balaam was going with these men with full intention of accepting the payment and doing what they wanted. I just don't understand this. I just don't get it. And so Balak got there and met him, and there is this offering that happens, and 3 different times, different places, different occasions, Balak sets the scene and invites the curse to come from Balaam. And all 3 times, not only does he not curse these people, he actually blesses the Hebrew people. It's what God gives him to do. He won't curse them, but he blesses them. And this makes Balak so angry because he's already established, before this thing started, when he sent the messengers the very first time, he sent them because he said, everybody knows that if you bless somebody, the blessing comes true. And if you curse somebody, the curse comes true. So he already believes that if Balaam has blessed these people, it's over. They're going to be blessed, and the Moabites are going to fall. Well, some things begin happening there. Balaam goes home, and Balak went his way, and it seems like maybe the story ends. Except right after this, in chapter 25, there are some things that begin to happen, some idolatrous practices that creep into the Israelite people. And that leads us up to chapter 31 of Numbers. And in chapter 31, there is the slaughter of the Midianite people. But included in that slaughter is Balaam, the son of Beor. This same guy, this prophet, is killed when the people of God moves and what Moses leads the people into, and these 12,000 or so men go out and make war against Midian, and they kill Balaam, the son of Beor, with a sword. Now, if you come down to verse 16, behold, these women caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so the plague was among the congregation of the Lord. If you take this verse 16, and you look at a couple of the passages, particularly in Revelation, where it speaks about Balaam placing a stumbling block in front of the people, and you try to make some sense of that, it looks like what happened is that while Balaam maybe did not curse the people the way Balak had asked him, it seems that somewhere along the way he gave him the formula for how to defeat them. You see, maybe Balaam understood enough to know that while he couldn't curse them explicitly, if someone else led these people into sin, that would put them on the bad side of God. And if it put them on the bad side of God, then maybe God himself would not bless them the way he said he was going to. And ultimately, it might accomplish the same thing. And maybe even this was paid for by Balak. And it worked for a time. And it required a terrible blood price to be paid. But somehow Balaam himself is caught in the end of this. Now, I got to be honest, there are lots of questions here. Lots of questions. And not a lot of great answers. And I read this story and I ponder it. And I have been for years. I've been just kind of sitting on this story and wondering exactly what in the world does it mean? And maybe more specifically, what can we take away from this today? What is there that I can offer you? Well, I mean, on the one hand, you know, the idea of consulting with God before making decisions, of going to God in prayer before we decide to do something, well, that's always a good thing, right? My family's tried to take that practice, and sometimes I think maybe we've interpreted the signs from God correctly, and sometimes maybe we just already had our mind made up and prayed about it nonetheless, and then decided that certain things that we saw might have been the signs from God. But going to God before making big life decisions, yeah, that's a pretty important thing. Listening to what God says, that's pretty important, isn't it? Only going where God says to go, only doing what God says to do. That seems to be a pretty good way to live your life. And yet somehow there's something going on here with Balaam, and I don't know if Balaam is greedy. I don't know if the money eventually overtakes him and that matters more than being faithful to God. It's hard to know, isn't it? But I can tell you this. There is at least an indication that through some sort of action, Balaam led other people into such a sinful place that it cost them their life before God. And I know that's something that can be true today as well. I could do it. As a spiritual leader, if I decided I wanted to do so for financial gain or some other reason, I could deliberately teach things that weren't true, that weren't the way of God. I could lead people into sinful practice for which there would definitely be some accountability before God. Maybe it wouldn't go down exactly like this with swords and a physical battle. Maybe when the New Testament talks about the fact that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against a lot of times the unseen authorities. Maybe there's something here. I don't bring you this tonight because I want you to have unanswered questions. But I learned a long time ago that sometimes the only answer is that we don't have a great answer. Sometimes we look for answers and we look for solutions and we look for meaning. And it's just not always available to us. Sometimes we just have to read these things and try to find something. And And yet, even in this story, when it seems like Balaam is doing the right thing, Balaam says, I can't go. And then God says, yeah, go ahead and go. But then God is angry with him for going. And the angel's telling him, if you'd have gone one step farther, I'd have killed you. Well, I'll turn back. No, go ahead and go. And when he goes, he does exactly what he's been told to do. It's so confusing for me. I think maybe that's one of the reasons that sometimes I look at my faith and I realize that my faith is not one that is built on having all the answers to all the questions. Faith is built on trusting God, even when God being God doesn't look anything like I think it ought to. Faith really is about trust, and trusting God when I don't see the answers, when I can't have the answers, when I can't figure something out, to trust that God is still God and he's no less God because I don't understand what he does here than if he does exactly what I want him to do. And maybe that's another important thing to remember too, that God will not always do everything I want him to do. Even though I love him and I trust him and I'm trying to follow him, I'm trying to be truthful to him and I'm trying to lead others to him, there are just moments where God's not going to do what I want him to do, what I think he ought to do. And maybe that's an important thing to know too, is that everything following God is not always going to work out exactly like I want it to. Well, I don't know if you've enjoyed this quick look at Balaam with me or not. You may wish that you had turned this off a few minutes ago. But this much I'll tell you. I don't know the answers to these questions. But I still trust that God is God and that he can handle whatever comes, whether I understand how he handles it or not. Thanks for stopping by.